We are the Church of the Larger Fellowship, a Unitarian Universalist congregation with no geographical boundary, working toward creating a global spiritual community, rooted in profound love, which cultivates wonder, imagination, and the courage to act. Adapting to the COVID-19 pandemic has been difficult for many bricks and mortar congregations. Early on in the pandemic, we were in a unique position to assist many congregations with the transition. We hosted special episodes of The VUU, provided advice and counseling to religious professionals, and trained congregations for live streaming worship, all while providing robust online programming for our members. From worship to covenant groups, from classes to pastoral care, and from our monthly magazine to our letter writing ministry, we have found ways to build connection and community even through the screen. We have been a model for ministry on the margins, providing services for isolated Unitarian Universalists, becoming a spiritual lifeline for our members in prison, and investing in innovative ministry. We know better than anyone how deep and meaningful connections can be formed even from a distance. Unitarian Universalists have faced many challenges in these times, and we continue to persevere and to fight for justice and equity for all people, especially during moments of crisis. We are proud to be a leader in this faith movement, and we invite you to get involved in our ministry. We strive to be a place where anyone from anywhere can find spiritual refuge anytime they need it. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Larger Fellowship. We are so excited to bring you an all-new episode of The VUU. The VUU is a weekly Unitarian Universalist talk show discussing important faith-based topics from an anti-racist, anti-oppressive, and multicultural perspective. Every Thursday for the past 7 years, we have welcomed guests from every corner of the world. Our guests are writers, scholars, activists, and religious thought leaders who are shaping Unitarian Universalism and society for the 21st century and beyond. I hope today's show inspires you. Hope it builds your faith. Hope it gives you perspective to see the power of Unitarian Universalism at work in your life. Enjoy the message.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another exciting and interesting episode of the Voices of Unitarian Universalism, known by some as the VUU and by others as the VUU, whichever you call it, or if you call it neither of those. We're so glad to have you here. I'm Michael Tino, part of the lead ministry team of your Church of the Larger Fellowship, joining you from gray, rainy Peekskill, New York, where Oakside Elementary School had its first spring concert in 2.5 years this morning. And of course, it was raining. So it was the first time that parents were allowed inside the elementary school since the beginning of 2020 because it was raining outside. And my child stood there in her mask like this the entire time, except when she was speaking. She actually had a speaking role. She didn't like do much of the singing and dancing, but she spoke clearly and beautifully, and we were so proud of her. So that's what's going on here in Peekskill. Aisha Hauser, how are you out there on the West Coast?
Hi, I'm Aisha Hauser, and I come to you from Seattle, Washington, land of the Coast Salish, also known as the Duwamish, the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish, also known as Seattle. I'm doing okay. It's, I didn't think that I was impacted by all the gray, but we've had sunny days the past couple of days. When the sun comes out, it's like I turn into a sunflower. So I'm like, I wonder if I'm more impacted by gray skies than I was telling myself. But so that's been an interesting discovery for me. But I think I mean, for the most part, I think humans like sunflower, like the sun, not too much, but just enough, the sweet spot of the sun. So right today it's rainy, a little bit rainy, but I think the sun wants to make an appearance. So hopefully that'll happen. But otherwise I'm doing well. Chris, how about you?
Rivera, she, her pronouns, and I'm coming to you from beautiful rural Central Virginia, where the weather has been just glorious. But I think the trees that were attacking Michael earlier are now attacking us with the pollen. So that's been a little challenging. But other than that, it's just really beautiful outside. Like everything is sprung and it's not too hot and humid yet. So I'm a happy camper. DC, how are you doing?
I am doing well. Hi, everybody. I'm DC Fortune, and I am coming to you from a moderately sketchy motel in the Susquehanna Valley, which is the historic home of the Susquehannock people of the Iroquois Nation. And I am just south, just downriver of the confluence of the north and west branches of the Susquehanna River, which is beautiful, beautiful place. I'm here because I'm moving here to start a new ministry in July, and I'm very excited because, I mean, yeah, the weather's gray and crappy like everybody else, but I'm very excited because I just got an offer accepted on a home, and it's a delightful home, and it looks much that I love. It looks respectable on the outside, but on the inside, it looks like it was put together by the Weasleys. So it's just, so I'm excited for that. So, QuianaDenae, tell me the weather.
Good morning. Good morning. I would be remiss if I did not go back and just repeat two of the things that you said that have my spirit just giggling. You said a quasi sketchy hotel, and I thought, wait, there's hotels that aren't sketchy. So that was my first thought. I was like, oh, there's other varieties. Semi sketchy isn't the only choice. I need to get out. And then my second thought is how much I love you and how much the word you use just make me smile. And so I couldn't even introduce myself without acknowledging you, DC, and that joy that you brought me. I am not moving. I am right here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, the land of the Potawatomi. No, I'm saying their name wrong, and I do apologize. I can't find it in my head. And the weather here is really stunning. It rained all day yesterday, so I just watched the British baking show. I skipped through all the baking parts, so I got through all of season 9 yesterday. It was really great. And also, I still can't cook. I'm clearly aware of that. I burned something in the oven yet. Like, I'm going to tell y'all the story and then I'll let go. Here's the deal. I bought some food from Costco, like the pre-made stuff. And I'm like, okay, I can't eat all of this. This is like 6 meals for me. So I go to put one in the oven, and the first time it cooks really fast. And I'm like, that wasn't right. But the packaging says cover it with tin foil. So I cover it and I cook it for 25 minutes and I go check, and like all of the cheese that was around the ravioli is now a disc. I could go get that out of the trash for you, but I'm not that person. And I was like, I can't even cook things in the oven anymore. So I'm just, I'm hungry a lot. That's the end result of that adventure. So all of that is to say, I'm here, I'm whole, I'm happy, and this is my sanctuary to be with all of you and to be in a space where we can laugh and talk and love unapologetically. So with that, I turn it over to my friend, Michael.
Oh, goodness. Oh, goodness. I'm glad we can laugh with one another. I neglected to mention Peekskill, where I am, is the land of the Kitchewan and Wappinger bands of the Lenape Nation here in the Hudson Valley of New York. So we like to start our show with a Unitarian Universalist Roundup, and we didn't discuss this before. What's going on in Unitarian Universalist land other than the looming General Assembly, or impending, or soon to come people, what's going on in Unitarian Universalist land other than friends?
I think there's a bunch of successful candidating. Well, successful. I hate to call it successful and unsuccessful.
Right.
There's a bunch of callings to congregations of settled ministers based on candidating weeks. So that's been really exciting to see come across my feed. That's been really wonderful. I'd also like to give a shout out to the Reverend Sophia Betancourt, who was featured in, oh God, was it the LA Times or Washington Post? I can't remember. Not LA Times, New York Times. For being on the steps of the Supreme Court of the United States, holding space for what faith means in this time. It was a beautiful thing, and was able to actually converse in debate with some folks who were trying to use faith and religion in a way that would confine a person as opposed to the way it is supposed to liberate a person. So that was just a really beautiful thing to be able to witness.
That is such a generous way of describing those hateful people. I appreciate the generosity of your heart. Anything else people know of going on in Unitarian Universalism these days?
I am so not that involved. I am so not that involved. Yesterday was offer date, Interim Ministries. So a lot of our colleagues, a lot of our clergy colleagues now have an idea where they're going. I will tell you, from having been in the search, having that clarity is such a relief, both for the congregations and for the minister who now has to figure out where to ship their stuff.
Excellent. And I'm hoping that the congregation that I am serving for another 2 more months-ish is about to announce their next minister too. So it is a big relief to congregations to know who's coming to hold them in their transition time. Well, if that's all that's going on in Unitarian Universalism, then we can dive right into our topic today. I am told that Tuesday, the day before yesterday, is known in international LGBTQIA circles as Ida Hobbit. That means the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, Interphobia, and Transphobia. Am I getting it right? And so, because we were trying to address that and actually have an interesting thing, we invited my favorite expert on international LGBTQI human rights, my dear friend Ian Lekus, who, for purposes of this show, has been an activist in human rights and social justice movements for more than 30 years. Ian has advised Amnesty International USA on LGBTQI plus human rights since 2013, and he is now a policy and communications specialist for the Council for Global Equality, a coalition of over 30 organizations working to make U.S. foreign policy more LGBTQI plus affirming and inclusive. It just so happens that I have known Ian for some 38 years or something ridiculous like that. So he can tell all sorts of embarrassing stories about me after the show is over. But welcome, Ian. How are you?
Doing all right. It's good to see you. Yeah, God, I just been doing the math on how long we've known each other, and I didn't realize I could count that high. It's great to be here 2 days after, indeed, Ida Hobbit, after the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, Interphobia, or sometimes intersexism, and transphobia. And to be back on The VUU, which I was on about 5 years ago. I'm not exact. I didn't actually check the date of my last visit, but it's great to be back here and to be with not only the team, but with the greater fellowship. I'm sitting here in Bethesda, Maryland, which, right on the edge of DC, which is also the historic land of the Anacostan people and the neighboring Piscataway and Pamunkey peoples of the greater DMV, the greater Delaware, Maryland, Virginia area. So so it is terrific to be here and to have the chance to talk with y'all about about the state of the global LGBTI movement, how things are going, which, as you can imagine, is a complicated story, and we could talk much longer than we have today.
Yeah, so in preparation for our show, to the viewers out there, Ian sent a bunch of links to us that that I was looking at, and just some really interesting articles that Tanner will link to in our show notes for our viewers out there to follow and learn more about. And there was one bunch of things that you've been working on recently about LGBTQI rights at the southern border of the United States, and so I thought maybe we'd start at the edges of the United States and work our way out to the rest of the world, since our focus is outside of this country today. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on there from a queer people's perspective?
Sure, and let me, I'll even sort of note one of the things that's really important for our work is to be clear about the fact that what's happening in the United States is happening around the world. And that, we talked in the introductory conversation about, for example, obviously, we're all worried is an understatement, extremely gravely concerned, and go further about the looming decision from the Supreme Court on reproductive justice. And that gets to the fact that there is a global movement against LGBTQI rights and sexual and reproductive health and rights. And I'm going to back to that later on, but I want to sort of even talk about the fact that the US border is part of a global story, where one of the things we're dealing with again and again is the crisis around refugee and migration. We're dealing with this when it comes to obviously the crises in both Ukraine and Afghanistan. We're dealing with this in terms of some of the world's largest refugee camps that exist, in northern Kenya, where you have refugee camps that are themselves the size of a Boston to San Francisco. And we're dealing with this on the US-Mexican border, where the reality is that the previous the US refugee system had been highly problematic even before 2016, but the previous administration did everything it could to dismantle a humane and responsive system for those trying to get into the United States legally, while also making the situation on the ground in other countries worse, so that people were more driven to flee. And especially when we see the southern border, we're talking a large part about migration from the Northern Triangle, from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, but we're also seeing lots of immigration coming from Jamaica and Haiti through the southern border, and frankly, a whole lot of immigration now from both Russia and Ukraine coming through the southern border, both Ukrainians obviously leaving the war, and Russians who feel there is no place for them in Putin's increasing, dictatorial Russia. So that's all context for the crisis at the border. And as problematic as the migration system is for everybody, it's really set up for heterosexual families and for gender normative appearing people. So the situation for refugees whose documentation lists a different gender than how you live life, is a problem. We're seeing that everywhere, from the southern border of the United States to people trying to flee Ukraine. We are seeing the fact that there is endemic violence against LGBTQ people, and especially transgender people and other gender nonconforming people in refugee camps along the southern border. And despite the tepid moves, the hesitancy of the Biden administration to fix things is compounded by the fact that, in fact, there are a whole lot of both Republicans, independents, and conservative Democrats who don't want to even take those tepid steps. There is, and so one of the things my organization did just a couple weeks ago is we led a small delegation of 5 congressional members, all from California, to visit 2 LGBTQ refugee shelters in Tijuana, Mexico, just inside the San Diego border. And the speakers at both shelters talked, who came from, again, Honduras, from Jamaica, from other parts of the Northern Triangle and the Caribbean, talked about the kind of violence they faced, the extortion they faced, the sexual violence they faced, and what they were fleeing, and then having to tell their story again and again, often in ways that can re-traumatize them as they're trying to access a system that is not set up to let in people who need refuge, and especially non-white people. And believe it or not, that's a short version.
So go on, QuianaDenae.
I was just going to say thank you for that history lesson and that grounding. So often we talk about things in ways that it assumes people know what's happening in the background or how we got there. And I needed that little bit of background to understand the depth of the problem, and to also understand that so often I think we as a culture are like, oh, GLBT, and that sits in one part of our mind, but we don't always understand how the tree and the root are connected. For us to be having this conversation and starting on the southern border and connecting all of the things that have been dismantled in our country the last 5 to 8 years is really powerful. And I just wanted to thank you for that, Ian.
Absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity, and I'm sure I'll talk about this more, but when then Secretary Clinton talked about LGBT rights are human rights and human rights are LGBT rights, we really are seeing that in every crisis we're facing, from Afghanistan, Ukraine, to COVID, to the global migration crisis, that there is no separating LGBTQ human rights from the broader rights around, whether political rights about freedom of expression and association, political activity, where they're talking about the right to healthcare, the right to an economic livelihood, to an education, and so on. That pervasively there are no special rights. We are talking about the fundamental human rights project of the last century that's under threat. The blue word of happiness these days, I know.
Well, there's a reason why there has to be an International Day against homophobia, biphobia, interphobia, and transphobia. It's because it exists, and it rears its head whenever and wherever people are most vulnerable, is my guess.
Right. And I think it's a good opportunity to point out that the political trends, popular, opinion, are out of sync. And we've certainly been hearing about this when it comes to the outrage about the likely overturning of Roe v. Wade, that 70% of Americans support the right to an abortion. And the trends around the world, not just in the global north, are towards greater LGBTI affirmation and inclusion. Are there places where that's faster than others? Absolutely. But certainly, we are, the number of, part of the conflict, that Russia has stoked in Ukraine is about the fact that Ukraine has, over the last decade, there are far-right movements. I do not want to minimize them, but there also has been an increasing willingness to embrace a trend towards LGBTI and feminist inclusion. It's nowhere near what I would like to see, or any of us listening would like to see, but the trend is in the right direction, and cultural change is moving in the right direction, but the forces against it are strong and loud.
What does the U.S. political policy around immigration or sending people outside of the traditional immigration routes? What is the policy around? Does it have any kind of recognition of the special risks that LGBTQ folks have if they're repatriated to their country of origins?
There's a lot of recognition, and even the Department of Homeland Security clearly recognizes that LGBTI people in many places face incredible risks if they're repatriated. At the same time, we're looking for codification of policies that, for example, that if you are a trans person, for example, from the Northern Triangle, that the presumption should be that you're vulnerable and at risk rather than that you having to prove it. Because the record is so clear about the extent of violence in, especially Honduras and El Salvador and Guatemala, against trans people and LGBTQI people more broadly, but especially gender nonconforming people. So we're working on that. A big thing right now is Title 42, and under Trump, in early 2020, not long after the COVID pandemic broke out in the United States and elsewhere, a little known provision of public health law, the Title 42, has been used as an excuse to limit immigration. There are, the public health establishment is clearly like this is a misuse of the law. The Biden administration has recently announced its plans to rescind it, and that has met to rescind Title 42, and that has met with a firestorm of opposition from politicians who otherwise have no interest in meaningful responses to COVID. It reeks of the way that 20 years ago, certain people in the Bush administration suddenly discovered Afghan women and girls' human rights to justify the invasion there. Here we have people who otherwise, throwing away their masks in glee, saying, "Oh, we must keep immigrants out in the name of COVID prevention." And there's still a critical number of Democrats who are buying into that as well, whether out of belief or whether out of political fear about the backlash.
One of the folks in our chat, because I'm watching the chat as well because I'm nosy. I've learned how to do two things at once. And I want to speak to it because I think it's important. One of our friends asked, they said, "I wish we could just say queer." And it's so interesting as a Black person. I know the difference between Black harm when someone's explicitly harming Black people and when someone's just willing to harm people of color, right? So I think there's a power in saying queer when it's appropriate, but I also think there's a time to really call out what's happening. And when I think about the day that happened on Tuesday, which I'm not going to mess up, there is a need to say trans people are explicitly harmed differently. There is a need to say immigrants who come from particular countries experience a different kind of harm for being transgender. There's no harm in saying generically queer people are not, loved on, right, as a culture. But there's an importance, I think, in saying Black transgendered folks are harmed differently. And it doesn't take away from queer harm. It doesn't but it names it. It explicitly names it, and it means that we have to engage with a different level of love and care. I guess to not minimize it, but to think, "Oh, it might rain, I might grab an umbrella," is very different than it is fucking hailing over trans and Black people. Here is a tarp, an umbrella, a camper, a tent. We will make sure you are safe. And I guess I just want to just kind of name that. We're explicitly naming who's harmed, so we can explicitly give them the care and the attention that they deserve. And if we make everything generic and call it queers, not in the pejorative, then we kind of forget how specialized that harm is and how specialized that healing needs to be. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense to me. And I think it also sort of leads into the fact that different people around the world refer to themselves differently. And that sort of me telling you how to identify yourself doesn't lead towards productive political and cultural outcomes. Much of the law in the global law is around sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics rather than saying LGBTI. One of the things that we know is that almost certain you may have noticed how the homophobic, biphobic, transphobic forces in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, slightly different from the United States for reasons I'll get to, talk about LGBT being imported from the West. It's new colonization. The president of Gambia somehow comparing the promotion of LGBTI human rights as a successor to European colonization of West Africa. Now, this is offensive But the reason that this resonates is that there are the tiniest kernels of this, of accuracy, and not that as we have a growing global movement as activists on the ground. For example, there's an LGBT organization, all 54 African countries on the African continent. It's easy to talk about, quote unquote, monolithic African homophobia. Every country has an organization. Some have really vibrant movements. Adopting the LGBT initialism, adopting rainbow flags, framing this work in terms of ideas of rights that come out of the West gives the tiniest kernel to the people who say that this is all imported by the West and the West is imposing it. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't do this, but we do have to and of course, they're not recognizing historic systems of gender and sexual diversity, through history, and that there's been sexual diversity in sub-Saharan Africa for many centuries, but it wasn't called gay, lesbian, bi, trans. So there's flattening of difference and specificity that comes with using queer. Like I identify as queer. Like I literally was having this conversation yesterday about somebody, I was, because I'm now old enough to be interviewed by college undergrads about my time in college. That it's like so they were asking about how language changed. That was their project, and sort of about like actually I identify personally and sexually as gay and politically queer, but I'm also the product of my world, my society, my history, the history around me, and so those things mean a lot to me. Like I'm writing a book, Queer and Present Dangers. I am not running away from queer, but because I adopted, I can't make everybody else adopt it and make it feel right for them. Mm-hmm. And absolutely.
Lost Mike.
Lost
Have
him.
we lost him?
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, there we go. I think you need to re-say that, Michael.
So what I said earlier, and I wasn't on camera, was that it's interesting to me that people are seizing on LGBT identity or LGBTQ identity being what's a vestige of Western, especially American colonialism in the world, when the stories that I've heard so often are of American conservative fundamentalist Christians exporting homophobia to places like sub-Saharan Africa, going and organizing around anti-LGBTQ sentiment, convincing countries, organizing people, colonizing with homophobia. I'll put it that way.
One of the things I'm throwing myself more and more into, with the Council for Global Equality, the two issues that are sort of increasingly becoming my bucket: one, migration, and refugee issues; two, conversion therapy. And I don't think I fully had a grasp of how this is a multi-billion-dollar industry promoted by, especially not only US and other European evangelicals, but profit makers, who are just making a ton of money off of conversion therapy, off this torture, and how extensive the conversion therapy networks are. I am forgetting the name of a think tank I recently discovered, but who's done some remarkable research on Google searching and search engines broadly speaking, and sort of like where the big Google, Bing, and the big Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, have sort of limited language search results around conversion therapy. And unsurprisingly, the closer you are to Silicon Valley, the more likely you are to be protected from dishonest search results. But when you get further, even the difference between the Spanish results in the U.S. U.S. Spanish-speaking citizens and residents versus Colombia, and the difference between what you see in the United States or Australia for English results versus for Kenya are really dramatic. I'm going to have to look up the name of the organization and get back to you. But there's been some there's sort of really interesting research about this, and just the extent of how do we effectively fight conversion therapy when this is so often framed in terms of right to religious freedom. We talk a whole lot about other religious issues and that we wrestle with, and how that can be a cloak for limiting the freedom of others. But conversion therapy should certainly be in that discussion in the U.S. and around the world.
It's happening I didn't realize how prevalent it was in the Eastern Bloc nations and in Russia until was it the Georgian there was going on in Georgia and Chechnya, and so the conversion therapy is also, when you say global, it is global. It is also really horrific. My question to you is, what I think is clear to folks who are wanting to fight for liberation, that taking away Roe v. Wade is actually the catalyst, right? The goal is not, none of these people give a shit about life. That's clear. We don't need to go into that. This is about controlling other people. And in the name of whatever you want to say it's the name of, I think it is religiously motivated by Christianity. So my question to you, in ways, I don't want to just say, what do we do? But clearly that's happening, right? This is the goal, is ultimate control of people's autonomy and their bodies. And this is also going to target the LGBTQ community. So what are some of the ways that you have recognized organizing? What are you doing? I mean, we're all now, preparing for the end of Roe and beyond. So I'm curious what you're, in terms of intersectionality, and what your organization is doing.
Certainly Amnesty all hands on deck, with the, sort of protesting. This is, my close colleague, was just on hill on the steps, 2 weeks on the steps of the Supreme Court, this week on the steps of the Vermont legislature, where she divides her time between here and DC, with protests. But what do we do more than protest? How do we build networks that continue to get people access to the services they need? I was just I was just thinking about, I think we're still struggling for the answer. I was thinking about this yesterday when I was reading an article about Starbucks promising to provide funding for its staff who need to travel for an abortion or need to travel for gender affirming surgery. Now, this is also Starbucks, whose labor policy a lot to be desired, and I am not confident about putting all of my human rights eggs in the basket of multinational corporations. And frankly, there are even worse than, it gets a lot worse than Starbucks, and Starbucks has a lot to be desired, leaves a lot to be desired. One of the things that's really terrifying right now is I don't feel like progressives have enough of a sense of how to combat what we're up against. And for all the important, we have, broadly speaking, talked effectively about intersectionality around identity, but not necessarily in terms of the lived impact of something like reproductive care. I think going from identity to actual policy is the next stage for our movement. And I don't know, and how do we build those answers fast? Yeah. If I had a magic wand, I'd be waving it pretty frantically right now.
Can I say a thing?
You're muted, QuianaDenae.
Oh, but DC was trying to say something.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, DC.
Oh, I think we are chasing.
Can't hear you, DC. Or I can't
Jesus.
hear you.
I don't know how to fix
I
that.
can hear him.
Oh, okay.
You can hear me?
Never mind.
Okay. Excellent.
Can you hear DC, Ian?
Somewhat.
Okay. All right.
It's
All
just
right,
muffled,
so,
but I can get it.
Okay. So I think we're missing. I think we're being distracted by our dedication to human rights and human liberation and human beings. And I think the motivation behind this whole thing is not about controlling people, it's about profit. They don't give a shit about people. They want to exploit the land that's under the people. Okay, all of the exporting of hate to the African continent tends to happen in places where there are untapped, unexploited natural resources. Okay, this is Roman Christian imperialism pointed east from the United States. It's about gathering wealth and using church to do it, and to do that and get people to do horrible, horrible things. If you can convince them that it is the right and proper thing to do, they will do it. And honestly, like Aisha was right when she said they don't give a fuck about life. They don't give a rat's ass about life, but they also don't care about actually controlling individual lives. The point is to keep everybody in such turmoil that they are unable to resist. And if there are enough of them who are willing to say, oh my goodness, we must go save XYZ people who are behaving in ways we don't want to, that is a beautiful distraction for the multinational corporations that are funding these religious, shall we say, mission work. Okay, they're getting their money somewhere. Where do you think they're getting it? They're getting it from multinational corporations that want to exploit the oil and the minerals and all of the natural resources that are underneath the people who are in the way. Okay, so and I think we as progressives, our focus, and as rightly so, is on human beings. It is on persons. It is on people who are living and breathing and loving and wonderful people. And that's who we want to save. And that's who we want to liberate. And that's who we want to lift up and allow to be fully everything they can be. And we're being short-sighted about our goals in relation to the overarching goal of the money structure behind the oppression that's happening. Does that make sense? Ian?
It makes sense. I don't think it's as much of an either or as that presupposes.
Okay.
I would agree that, for example, where I suspect I are on the same page is I don't think Vladimir Putin, or for that matter, Donald Trump, gives a flying you-know-what about LGBTI people. I think that's entirely calculated, cynical, oh, this will help me.
Right.
I think that this is about, so when we're talking about either of those examples, we're absolutely talking about, sheer calculation of power. But I wouldn't, I think where I might caution about that is particularly to look again at the US Republican Party, where the money establishment assumed it could control all the forces of hate and fear and didn't realize who was writing who. That, it's all easy to look at respectable, forces in the Republican movement over the last 40 years who were willing to exploit racist tropes, who were willing to sort of campaign against same-sex marriage, who were willing to sort of appoint a justice here, a vice president candidate there, who, threw red meat at the base, not knowing that the base was actually a whole lot more powerful than them and sort of had agendas that don't always fit along the lines of sheer greed. I will never, ever underestimate the power of greed in, undermining society, but I don't think it's monocausal.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
So,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say QuianaDenae was going to say something at the same time that DC was. So I just want to make sure that if it's still in your head, you get to say
it. It is not. It is gone. I just wanted to. I don't remember, but because I was listening so intensely to DC, I passed the floor to my friend Chris.
Well, I think that keeping an eye on both the nuanced complexity of what is going on and the really easy, we're seeing evil at work in our time, and being able to hold both of those, because different things motivate different people, right? And so the motivation of folks who are money and wealth and motivated can be different than people who are power motivated, because that power can be expressed by people who don't have money, resources and power that way, but they can want to express their power over other people's bodies, right? And so that being able to hold that complexity, but while also being able to name that this is evil at work and being worked upon in our lives, and that people of faith have a responsibility to come forward and say, this isn't okay to do in our name, because it's many different faiths that are doing this, right? that are doing this harm. So, we as people of faith who are trying to lean and work into the liberatory part of our faith as Unitarian Universalists, we have to be able to say this cannot stand, and this cannot be done in the name of faith.
And to your point, yes, to everyone's, I think, Ian, I think and I've been guilty of this over the years. I don't think I am anymore. However, I could be. In progressive movements, I think there's a naivete of what we're really dealing with. So it's the marriage in hell of violent extractive capitalism and fundamentalist religion, who are like, we don't give a fuck why we're doing that. We say fuck here, Ian. We don't give a fuck.
Okay.
Often and well.
We don't give a fuck that you want to make a lot of money, and the people making money are like, we don't give a fuck whether or not you believe in heaven or hell. We just want to oppress the same people for different reasons. So I think, while to your point, DC, that there is absolutely a desire of control for resources, the way to get to there's also very much within violent extractive capitalism the desire to control bodies. Now, it may or may not be attached to you're going to hell or heaven, and I don't think does Starbucks give a shit, really? No, because as you said, Ian, their labor practices, they may be paying for college, or they may be giving perks, but they're also totally union busting and against unions. So that's also capitalism needs a conscience to start or it just needs to go away. But so I think there is, and I don't know how to get people out of this naivete, because I also, okay, I'm going to talk for myself. I don't want to be so rooted in despair that the fear becomes overwhelming, right? But rather it's like, no, just enough how bad it is, still have room in our lives for joy, but still fight it.
So
yeah, and I think
to
your point, like, sorry, go, Quiana.
No, Chris.
Okay, to your point, like, please. That's why we say because there are people in Starbucks who want liberation. There are people in Starbucks, in corporate, in the stores, in their, like, there are Unitarian Universalists who are working in those corporate atmospheres, who we say, if you are going to be Unitarian Universalist on Sunday, you need to be Unitarian Universalist on all the rest of the days of those weeks, which is meaning when you are in those spaces, you need to be acting upon your faith, right? And your faith says that you need to call this shit out and make sure that these corporations do have a moral conscience. There's nothing wrong with a corporation having a, a moral conscience, because we see corporations who are doing it to our detriment, right? And they're doing it really well to our detriment. So we can shift that moral conscience.
Chris, I remember what I wanted to say before DC and what Aisha brought up for me, but I hope Ian can speak to as well on an international level, which is how do we cultivate joy in these really hard moments? How do we maintain who we are, our loving families and communities, chosen birth, however we came to get to that F being family this time, however we got there, how do we maintain joy? Where are ways that we can not just give to maybe the abortion fund, but how can I give to like the Grubhub fund after the abortion? How can I not just put up a flag on my social media page that says I'm really sad that, people who are maybe in some part of the world who don't have access to healthcare how can I be more intentional and more engaged in the joyful part of being who we fully are? And I don't know if you have an answer for that or if anyone has an answer, but I don't want us to forget joy. There is joy in this queerness. There is happiness in this queerness. There is vivation. I don't know. I just made that word up and I kind of like it. Being vibrant. There is a vibrance and a texture that comes with being queer for me that I refuse to let go of. And it is why I stand out in the street. It is why I will, give money. It is why I talk about reproductive rights without using the word, women only, because I know that things are bigger and my community is bigger and what I can behold is so much bigger. So how do I get a big bowl and put us all in with some ice cream and a disco ball and a dance party before we go do that thing that's really hard? Or how do we restore ourselves after that thing that's really hard? Anybody?
I mean, as I listen to you, I'm thinking, how I completely agree. And, I think about both our ancestors and the young folks coming after everybody on this call who, sort of how our ancestors found joy, how, each new generation finds new ways of finding joy. I'm particularly thinking about this in a week where we lost Urvashi Bad, who is just sort of this, and I want to sort of, I just edited, I think it wasn't even out by the time I sent you the links yesterday, but I'll forward up with that as well. Who was just this extraordinary visionary South Asian American queer who we lost to cancer over the weekend in her early 60s, who was just really deep at the power of calling people in, not calling people out. Sort of build a movement that is moves forward with love and passion and desire against everything we're up against. I think reading some of the tributes to her about her talking not only at huge protest rallies but at workshops on sex, at queer conferences, that sort of we protest in multitudes, we fuck in multitudes, we dream in multitudes. One of the thing and sort of may her memory be a revolution. Thinking about the ways that COVID has, on one hand, isolated us to little squares, but on the other hand, given us new channels to invent, even when in a post-pandemic world. That we're not going to spend time sort of complicating that, even though we know it's far more complicated than that. But to imagine the ways we can connect with each other, both in person and over distance. One of the things I think about and still figuring out how to reimagine were just these incredible global queer activist gatherings that I got to witness here in DC. Bringing people to cohorts of activists to learn from each other. And now getting to follow them, 5 years later, 3 years later, and sort of see the rich networks they have built that span, trans activists in India and in Botswana, people running for office in Chile and Peru, activists continuing the fight in Russia and Ukraine under incredible odds, and so on. from the smallest Pacific islands to the biggest country in the world, the kind of creativity and passion, the thing that gives me hope is the generations coming after us, even as we, sort of honor and learn from our ancestors.
Oh, I want to just, I'll say my last thing that I'm going to say today's show, because I want to sit and listen and just kind of soak this all in. I want to acknowledge the ancestor that you all just mentioned. And I was writing in the chat that the doodle today is honoring the legacy of Korean American disability activist Stacey Parker Milburn. And if you haven't gone and seen it, it is precious and it's beautiful. I never knew that particular person in real time, but their work and their legacy lingers on. And it is a gift to all of us, just like that of the person whom you all spoke, whose name I don't want to mess up. So I just want to say we have a tremendous opportunity to love on each other in this moment before we take a deep breath and have to go into what's next, because the fight is on. The reality is that we, like, the little bit of safety we have gathered is crumbling around us, and we have to fortify ourselves for what is next. And I'm glad that we're having a conversation about the reality of other LGBTQI people around the world, so that we can remember that they are a part of our family and that they need as much love, support, joy, and excellence as we all get on this little turtle island as well. So thank you for being here, Ian, and for reminding my little heart that we are bigger and better than I ever dreamed.
Absolutely delighted to be here.
Well, and it's important to recognize that LGBTQIA folks, or whatever they call themselves in other parts of the world, exist everywhere. Right? Like we're everywhere.
Or y'all would have no culture ever. Would be no.
We have about 5 minutes left, and we haven't explicitly brought up our intersex siblings yet, and I'm wondering if there are one or two things around the world that you want to highlight with regard to intersex rights.
Right. Yeah, we're definitely at the point where people, for the U.S. based viewers of the VUU, we're the I is getting added sporadically in the US, but the global movement has sort of incorporated intersex for some years, and there's various reasons that that's been slower in the United States. But we're, I just finished reading more of the State Department's human rights reports than you want to know, and we're still figuring out, like, okay, the word is getting included everywhere without necessarily the concerns. We are seeing progress on a slow movement towards outlawing, genital mutilation, and sort of really thinking about sort of like, how does somebody get to actually determine what their sex is? I was listening to the UN Ida Hobbit event just this past Tuesday, and the representative from the former executive director of Interact, which is the largest US-based intersex organization. Intersex characteristics are more common than identical twins. The number of intersex people in the world is estimated at roughly the population of Japan. So we're talking about well over 100 million people, and that there isn't anywhere near this kind of conversations. And we're still figuring out how to be an effective ally for those of us who are not intersex. But I think, continuing to sort of fight for bodily integrity and autonomy that links reproductive justice, the ability to determine, to not have surgery except if you decide to, not have somebody else make that decision for you, to live as your body, with the body you have. Those are some of the key things we're certainly working on right now. The Council for Global Equality put out last December, as part in concert with the Summit for Democracy, which is a mess we do not have time for. But we did a scorecard of the laws around the world for the 110 countries participating in the summit, 30 different characteristics, 30 different issues related to sexual identity, sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics. And the only country in the world to get a perfect score was Malta. And I bring this up because Malta has been, of all countries, leading the way on intersex inclusion and rights. Argentina and Uruguay also have actually done a pretty good job too in the last 2 years. But I would point you to the, if you Google, or I'll get the links, Global Council for Global Equality Summit report cards, you'll see sort of at least at the federal level, what's happening with intersex laws and rights around the world, at least in those 110 countries that are somewhere between a thriving democracy and kind of a democracy, sort of, maybe.
So Joy also in Malta for our Maltese intersex siblings.
Please tell me we have viewers in Malta.
We might. The Church of the Larger Fellowship goes all over the world, and I don't know that we have members in Malta, but we certainly could. And if you're in Malta, let us know. Give us a shout, and we lift you up and celebrate that you got a perfect score. And it's the top of the hour. So do we have anything, final words to leave folks with?
Thank you, Ian.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great to have the chance to talk with you all.
Thank you.
This has been the VUU.
Boo, I love that.
See you next week.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you for joining us. Special thanks to those of you who give generously to this ministry. It is because of you that this ministry is possible. You can click the link in the description to give now, or visit CLFUU.org/give for more information. We hope you will join us next week for another episode of The VUU.